Silence, please. All stand. This coroner's court is now sitting.
Good morning.
Good morning, Your Honour.
Ms Ward.
Your Honour, I appear with Mr Wilcox as counsel assisting Your Honour in today's hearings. They cover the Busby's Flat Rapville fire, the Rumba Complex fire, Ruined Castle fire and the Little L Complex fire.
Thank you, Ms Ward. Let's
And-
take appearances.
Your Honour, my name is Woodland. I appear for the Commissioner of the Rural Fire Service, National Parks and Wildlife Service and the Forestry Corporation of New South Wales.
Thank you, Ms Woodland.
With Your Honour's leave, can I sit down for the submissions today?
Absolutely. I understand you have an injury.
I
and
do.
Of course, you may remain seated, Ms
Thank
Ward.
you, Your Honour. We'll deal firstly with the Busby's Flat Rapville fire. Your Honour, these are the closing submissions for the coronial inquiry into the cause and origin of the Busby's Flat fire, which burnt on the lands of the Gullybull people within the Richmond Valley local government area. It was also known as the Rapville fire, taking its name from the village of Rapville, which came under attack from the fire on the 8th of October 2019. The inquiry has been conducted pursuant to Section 30, subsection 1 of the Coroners Act of 2009 and is accordingly limited to determining the cause and the origin of the fire, if able to be established to the satisfaction of the court. Again, in these submissions, Your Honour, we note that this fire was one of very many fires that burnt across the state of New South Wales in the 2019-2020 bushfire season. Not all fires were reported to the coroner. Not all fires reported to the coroner proceeded to a coronial inquiry into cause and origin. Not all fires that proceeded to a coronial inquiry into cause and origin will continue to a further consideration via a general inquiry as part of stage 2 of Your Honour's proceedings. It is submitted that it is not necessary for the Busby's Flat fire to proceed to further investigation via a general inquiry. Whilst the brief of evidence includes questions from community members about why certain decisions were made at certain points during the fire in an attempt to contain it, it is not it is not possible for this court to attempt to answer every question raised in every brief collated across the 2019-2020 season. Other case studies will pick up on matters that also arise in the Busby's Flat brief, including matters such as the adequacy of warnings to local communities, the adequacy of communication between Fireground and the incident management team, and the use of strategic backburns. Turning then to the specifics of the fire. The Busby's Flat fire burned for about 2 months. A series of images will now be displayed upon the screen, taken from the coronial brief. I'll just let those load. Taken from the coronial brief at pages 266, 267, 270 and 271. They've been selected, Your Honour, just to remind those of us who were not there for the fire the devastating reach of its impact. This fire damaged a total area of approximately 51,826 hectares, most of which was privately owned land. The fire injured at least 7 people. It destroyed or damaged at least 56 homes and 134 other buildings and structures. It killed over 1,000 livestock and destroyed approximately 3,219 kilometres of fencing. It destroyed 5 kilometres of railway and associated infrastructure and a number of vehicles. It consumed about 14,590 hectares of state forest and national park. Fortunately, no lives were lost. The evidence demonstrates that the Busby's Flat fire at times travelled at an astonishing pace, fed by dry fuel loads, fanned by unfavourable weather conditions, and further worsened by what appears to be its own fire-generated pyrocumulus cloud. The chronology that follows is drawn from the evidence the court received within the coronial brief of evidence, which includes witness statements, RFS lightning strike data, and operational documents from the RFS, along with photographs and video footage from people directly affected, and weather data from the Bureau of Meteorology. The chronology also draws upon the oral evidence from the officer in charge of the fire inquiry, Detective Sergeant Hoffman, who gave evidence on 2 March 2022, and the RFS fire investigator, Mr. Peter Arthur, who gave evidence on 16 March 2022. Your Honour might recall this was one of the fires that ended up being split for a couple of weeks because when the matter was listed for hearing in Lidcombe, the flooding was so severely affecting northern New South Wales that our witness, Mr. Arthur, was unable to give evidence on the date originally listed. The Busby's Flat fire is believed to have commenced on 4 October 2019 at approximately 9:30 p.m. on the southern side of Busby's Flat Road. This was about 2 to 3 kilometres west of the intersection with O'Keefe's Road at Busby's Flat. So the aerial photograph from page 14 of the brief has been displayed on the screen. What Your Honour will see at the top of that image is Busby's Flat Road, marked out with the intersection to O'Keefe's Road towards the right-hand side of the screen, and an approximate area of origin marked with the red circle to the top right corner. According to the officer in charge of the investigation, O'Keefe's Road, so the road that drops down from off Busby's Flat Road in the top right corner, is more accurately described as an overgrown bush track. The fire was first observed by a truck driver, Mr. J. Ballard, who was travelling west along Busby's Flat Road towards Coomba. He was on his way to pick up wood chip from a remote logging site in the area. When he initially observed the fire, it was burning in grassland on the side of the road and was about 4 or 5 metres wide with flames of about 1 metre in height. Mr. Ballard was not able to immediately call 000 because there was no mobile phone reception on that part of Busby's Flat Road. He continued driving further west, and once he got reception, he was able to make a call. At 9:42 p.m, Mr. Ballard rang his boss, intending that his boss would then go on and call 000 and report the existence of the fire. However, there appears to have been a misunderstanding and no call was made to 000 at that time. This time marking for the phone call from Mr. Ballard to his boss is taken from Mr. Ballard's mobile phone. It reliably establishes that the fire commenced prior to 9:42 p.m. At around 11 p.m. that night, Mr. Paul Sybin, a resident on Busby's Flat Road, heard a vehicle, which he described as revving its engine, in a stationary position somewhere towards the intersection of Old Tenterfield Road and Busby's Flat Road. Mr. Sybin then heard the vehicle accelerating with excessive engine revving in a westerly direction, travelling from Old Tenterfield Road towards O'Keefe's Road and past his place. Mr. Sybin heard the vehicle engine quieten down, which he associated with it likely having to slow down to turn corners, and he then didn't hear the vehicle again for a period of time. He later heard what he thought was the same vehicle travelling back along Busby's Flat Road in the other direction. So he presumed that it had turned around and was travelling back towards Rapville. Although this sound was loud and distinctive enough to be remarked upon by Mr. Seibern, the court would accept that this vehicle is not implicated in the ignition of the fire. This is because, on Mr. Seibern's account, this vehicle travelled along Busby's Flat Road over an hour after the fire had already commenced, according to the evidence of Mr. Ballard. Meanwhile, Mr. Ballard, the truck driver, who had earlier witnessed the fire in its infancy, proceeded in his truck to the wood chipping site, collected another load of wood chip, and eventually began a return journey towards the mill at Broadwater over to the east. As he travelled back down a hill on Busby's Flat Road towards the area where he had earlier seen the fire, he could see the glow of the fire in the distance. By the time he reached the area where the fire likely originated, based on his earlier observation, he estimated the fire had spread to being about 40 to 50 metres wide. It was then burning in thick scrub. Again, Mr. Ballard did not have mobile reception at the scene, so he continued east along Busby's Flat Road for 2 or 3 minutes until he had reception, pulled over and rang 000 to report the fire. This was at 11:41 p.m, as corroborated by the 000 records. Around this time, a forestry worker, Mr. Clinton Gill, finished his shift a little earlier than usual at the same logging site that Mr. Ballard had earlier left. Mr. Gill and another workmate travelled from the Coombar site towards Busby's Flat. As they travelled from the west-southwest along Busby's Flat Road, Mr. Gill saw an old dual-cab Toyota Hilux coming towards him. He is able to remember this because he recalls having to flash his headlights at the Hilux to get the driver of that vehicle to dim their high beam lights. Mr. Gill shortly thereafter came across the fire. Before outlining the evidence as to what Mr. Gill saw next, it is important to note that the presence of the Hilux driving along Busby's Flat Road was not suspicious nor implicated in the fire. Firstly, Your Honour would accept that the fire had already been burning for over 2 hours by this point in time. Secondly, Your Honour would accept the evidence of Detective Sergeant Hoffman that there were a number of private properties along Busby's Flat Road and a number of places where people like to camp. It follows that there were legitimate reasons why someone might be driving along Busby's Flat Road on the evening of a long weekend. Returning to the chronology, Mr. Gill described the fire when he first saw it as being about 200 metres wide, burning way back into the bush and up into the treetops. That is, he described a much bigger fire than that described by Mr. Ballard. But the court does not need to resolve the discrepancy in their evidence. On either account, the fire was well established by this time. Mr. Gill also wanted to call 000, but like Mr. Ballard, had no mobile phone reception at the scene. He continued down Busby's Flat Road and eventually came upon Mr. Ballard, who had pulled over to the side of the road to make his call to the authorities. Mr. Ballard, being rather unfamiliar with the local area, was having some trouble explaining the precise location of the fire to the 000 operator. Mr. Gill took over the phone from Mr. Ballard and provided some more precise details about fire location. As a result, at 11:54 p.m, Captain Neil Burnett of the Rural Fire Service Rapville Brigade was alerted to the presence of the fire. He responded accordingly and arrived at the scene with another member of the Rapville Brigade at about 12:20 a.m. on 5 October 2019. At that time, the fire had burned approximately 300 to 350 metres along Busby's Flat Road, moving in a southwesterly direction through inaccessible terrain away from some of the local properties, including properties owned by Mr. Sybin and by Anya and Tom O'Keefe. According to Captain Burnett, the fire was burning through dry swamp and heavily timbered country that was inaccessible by vehicle. However, no properties at that time were threatened by the fire, and once other brigades arrived on scene, they developed a containment plan to execute at daybreak. At about 9 a.m. on 5 October 2019, a bulldozer arrived and started work on a firebreak along O'Keefe's Road. This included pushing in fire breaks across the property of Anya and Tom O'Keefe, further along Busby's Flat Road from Mr. Sybin's property. By the afternoon of 5 October 2019, the backburn had linked up to the main fire front. By nightfall, Captain Burnett said that the fire was burning in an area that was not too heavily vegetated. Containment efforts continued on 6 October 2019. Conditions then deteriorated on 7 and 8 October 2019, and containment efforts could not withstand changes in the fire brought on by treacherous weather conditions, including hot, dry conditions with a fresh westerly wind. On 7 October 2019, a total fire ban was declared and a fire control centre was set up. Additional crews were brought in. All backburning was suspended and property protection operations began. The fire ultimately travelled at a speed that was much faster than anticipated. Page 22 of the brief will now be displayed in court. This is a photograph illustrating that by the morning of 8 October 2019, the fire had travelled a considerable distance and farming properties on Old Tenterfield Road were coming under threat earlier than expected. As the fire jumped Old Tenterfield Road, it reportedly split into 3 distinct fronts. You can see Old Tenterfield Road is marked there on the map. Busby's Flat Road sits out towards the left-hand side of the map, and then Old Tenterfield Road is marked, Your Honour, with a reference to the Tarmac sawmill, which was impacted by the fire. As the fire jumped Old Tenterfield Road, it reportedly split into 3 distinct fronts. The first travelled in a northeast direction towards the Coombell area. The middle front travelled east and would later impact upon Rapville village. And the third front travelled south towards the Myrtle Creek area. By 11:12 a.m, the alert level for the Busby's Flat Fire was upgraded to emergency warning. Over the course of the afternoon, additional aerial support was requested and 2 large air tankers were deployed to make strategic runs to protect properties where fire crews were working. However, visibility was compromised and the air tankers were directed to lay retardant lines to the west of Rapville. Rapville village itself came under attack, forcing many residents in the small community to seek shelter at the schoolhouse. This is displayed in images from the brief now coming up on screen. We are having a little technical difficulty in the courtroom, Your Honour, but Your Honour will find those images in hard copy at page 26 and 27 of the brief. They show the fire impacting upon the village. One RFS vehicle, Wairala 1, was based at the school to defend it and the people sheltering inside. While they were there, the school came under ember attack, causing nearby trees to catch alight, but the school didn't burn and the lives there were saved. Sadly, though, several homes were lost along with the community hall. As it spread east, the fire crossed the Sydney to Brisbane railway line, damaging about 5 kilometres of railway and associated infrastructure. It moved into the Ellengowan, Myrtle Creek and Bunga areas. Several more properties were lost as the fire continued to burn with intensity well into the night. This is illustrated in the fire progression images from page 86 of the brief that are displayed on the screen. By about 10:56 p.m. on 8 October 2019, the fire at Busby's flat had spread to about 13,000 hectares. On 9 October 2019, the Long Gully fire merged with the western heel of the Busby's flat fire. That's illustrated in the fire prediction mapping that was briefly shown on, not fire prediction mapping, the fire spread imagery that was briefly displayed on screen. Meanwhile, the head of the Busby's flat fire itself had pushed further towards the east-southeast. From 9 October 2019, the fire continued to burn for weeks until solid containment options could be implemented. The fire was then not declared out until 4 December 2019. RFS fire investigator Mr. Peter Arthur first attended the general area of origin to commence a cause and origin inquiry or investigation on 5 October 2019. I will now turn to the key conclusions to be drawn from his investigation in context with the wider investigation undertaken by New South Wales Police. Key conclusions as to cause and origin. As to the date and likely time of ignition, Detective Sergeant Hoffman concluded the fire commenced sometime around 9:30 p.m. on 4 October 2019. This estimate was based upon the size of the fire when Mr. Ballard reported it to his boss during the telephone call made from his mobile at 9:42 p.m. Mr. Ballard had initially described a fire that was about 4 to 5 metres wide and about 6 metres into the bush from the edge of the road. This led Detective Hoffman to say in his evidence, and this is a quote, "Given the descriptions and how the land and the grass along the roadside was at that particular time, I would say that suggests it was a fairly recent ignition." As to the cause and origin of the Busby's flat fire, the court will have regard to the fire investigation report from Mr. Arthur and the fact that that Detective Sergeant Hoffman did not uncover any evidence pointing to any alternate cause for the fire. Mr. Arthur's oral evidence was important in clarifying matters more obliquely referred to in his report. He attended the scene of the fire on 2 separate occasions. The first inspection commenced at 4 p.m. on 5 October, the day after the fire had first been reported. The second occasion was a couple of weeks later, on the 26th of October 2019. The purpose of the second attendance was to have a second fire investigator confirm Mr. Arthur's findings. At the time of his first inspection at the scene, Mr. Arthur was able to speak to Captain Burnett, that is the first RFS responder to the fire, who pointed out the general area of origin. Using the general area of origin, Mr. Arthur was able to enter the scene and use the oft-described method of walking in a serpentine fashion, looking for macro fire indicators of fire spread and tracking them back to a suspected area of origin. Page 141 of the brief will now be brought up onto the screen, which shows some of the markers that Mr. Arthur used at the scene to track micro indicators of fire spread until fixing upon a probable point of origin, highlighted in this photo, with low intensity fire originating from this spot. In this case, having tracked the indicators to the point of origin, Mr. Arthur found a piece of steel belting with some remnants of rubber around it burnt on the ground. Mr. Arthur told the court he believed this was part of a tyre from a car or other vehicle. Other parts of rubber from a blown tyre were then observed to the north and south of the point of origin, spread along about a 50-metre range. Some of these remnants appeared to have tyre treads still visible on the rubber, and some remnants, such as the piece that Mr. Arthur found at the point of origin for the fire, still had pieces of steel belting contained therein. It was the fact that the piece of steel belting was located at the point of origin of the fire that allowed Mr. Arthur to hypothesise that the remnant actually caused the fire. Mr. Arthur concluded that the oxidisation to the wire was the result of damage from intense heat generated when the rubber burnt, telling the court, in his words, just given the heat, the intense heat that would have been there, the rubber around it would have been causing a fair bit of heat, causing the damage to the wire. Mr. Arthur fairly acknowledged that this is the first time I've seen a car tyre fire like this. I've seen it in car fires themselves. The tyres will burn with rubber, leaving the wire exposed. But this is the first time on the side of the road I've seen this happen. Mr. Arthur further told the court that at previous car fire scenes, he had observed similar discoloration of the steel belting as a result of oxidisation during the fire. He did not think that such damage to the steel belting could have occurred from weathering or exposure to the elements prior to the fire. Mr. Arthur's cause and origin report referred to a cigarette lighter which he had discovered and photographed in the general area of origin, but about 18 metres away from the point of origin. This can be discounted as a potential ignition source because Mr. Arthur tested the lighter and it didn't work. The lighting mechanism was rusted and the lighter itself was faded from sitting in the sun for quite a while. Mr. Arthur's cause and origin report also included photographs and references to 3 black markings on the road approximately 3 metres from the point of origin, which he concluded were skid marks from tyres. Mr. Arthur concluded these marks had been at the scene for quite a while. The court does not therefore need to determine whether those tyre skid marks could be accurately dated. Even if the markings could be accurately dated, there is no evidence that would permit the court to match the skid marks to any particular vehicle that had travelled along the scene. Ultimately, having tracked the indicators to the point of origin and then observing the oxidised wire at that point, along with the remnants of tyre tread that had been scattered to the north and south of the general area of origin, Mr. Arthur concluded that the fire was not the result of any intentional act. Mr. Arthur's view was that the fire had started as a result of the steel belting landing in dry, crisp grass and leaf matter. Detective Sergeant Hoffman agreed with Mr. Arthur that power lines, campfires, smoking, fire play, rail infrastructure and lightning could be excluded as potential causes of the fire. He agreed that there was no evidence of debris burning or that any equipment had been used in the area and therefore were not contributing causes. Detective Sergeant Hoffman was not prepared to go as far as Mr. Arthur as to the cause and origin of the fire, being due to a remnant from a tyre landing in dry grass by the side of the road. In the course of his investigation, Detective Sergeant Hoffman was provided with intel reported to Crime Stoppers and from community sources about other people, including locals, that might have been implicated in the fire. Following further investigation, Detective Sergeant Hoffman concluded that there was no credible evidence suggesting that any of those people were likely involved in starting the Busby's Flat fire. Detective Sergeant Hoffman's ultimate opinion was that the cause of the fire was unintentional, that is, not deliberately lit. Your Honour, it is submitted that the fire ignited at approximately 9:30 p.m. on 4 October 2019, adjacent to Busby's Flat Road and about 1 kilometre west of the intersection with O'Keefe's Road at Busby's Flat. The cause of the fire was an unintentional human act, with the fire most likely having started when steel belting from a piece of shredded tyre ignited dry, crisp grass and leaf matter present at the scene. Your Honour, those are the closing submissions on behalf of the Council Assisting Team.
Thank you, Ms Ward.
I'm not sure whether the RFS have anything that they wish to say in response to those submissions.
Nothing to add, thank you.
Thank you, Ms Woodland.
Your Honour, if it's convenient, I'll now move immediately to the closing submissions for the Rumba Complex fire, Dingo Tops Road. These are the closing submissions for the inquiry into the Rumba Dump, Dingo Tops Road fire. The Rumba Dump fire sits within a grouping of 3 fires with the collective name of the Rumba Complex fire, and the matter has been listed under that name. The inquiry into the Rumba Dump fire has been conducted pursuant to Section 30, subsection 1 of the Coroners Act, and is accordingly limited to determining the cause of the fire and the area of its origin, if able to be established to the satisfaction of the court. The Rumba Dump fire was first reported to authorities on 18 October 2019. Page 62 of the brief will shortly be showed in court, which will help the court understand the remote area in which the fire commenced and the rugged mountainous terrain within the Tappan Tops National Park, just northwest of Wingham, where it burnt. This is within the Mid-Coast local government area and the lands of the Bairapai people. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. So although it's a little difficult to see in scale on the screen, if we could perhaps zoom in, you'll be able to see, Your Honour, that within that national park area, the fire is recorded as having, or shown at least by that line scan, as having commenced close to one of the trails through the Tappan Tops National Park, marked as the Dingo Tops Road. The images on the screen will now move to some separate pages from the brief, being page 105-4, 5 and 6. So we'll move through those in turn. But to begin with, we have 105-4. This fire progression mapping puts the Rumba Dump fire into context with other fires in the area. On 15 November 2019, the Rumba Dump fire merged with the Thunderbolts Way Bretty and the Riley Creek Trail fires. So I'll just have those 2 fires circled on the screen with the cursor. So you've got Rumba Dump to the east of the map there, and then the Thunderbolts Way Bretty fire to its west, and the Riley Creek Trail fire broadly to the south. These 2 fires, Thunderbolts Way and Riley Creek Trail, had themselves earlier merged sometime between 9 and November 2019. Once these 3 fires merged, they were thereafter named the Rumba Complex Fire. This fire wasn't declared out until the 24th of January 2020, having by that time burnt for approximately 14 weeks. So if we now move to page 105-5 of the brief, Your Honour will see that the Rumba Complex fire has reached down and has virtually now shares a border with the fires to the south, being the Thunderbolts Way and Riley Creek Trail fires. And then if we move to page 105-6 of the brief, Your Honour will see that by this point, the fires have merged and have been renamed as the Rumba Complex. So that involves more than one fire. Ultimately, the fire damaged an area of approximately 153,200 hectares within the Tappan Tops National Park, the Dingo State Forest and beyond. At least 134 structures were destroyed, including many homes in the village of Boban, Caffrey's Flat and Kapara. The historic primary school of Boban, built in 1883, was severely damaged by the fire. It follows that the effects of the fire were devastating for many people who lost homes or infrastructure or other property. This loss wasn't necessarily quantified during the course of the coronial investigation that followed, because police prioritised recording events where people lost their homes. The brief of evidence the court has received thus underrepresents the actual and wider loss that extends beyond the loss of residential dwellings. The court had the benefit of evidence from Detective Chief Inspector Rodney Blackman of the Manning Great Lakes District. He told the court as follows: "It really is quite miraculous that there wasn't more loss in terms of the human toll. Certainly some of the days within this period, we had reports coming back from the field saying that we need to mark this location because we anticipate there will be loss of life in that area where people were trapped behind active fire lines. It was very much on everyone's mind that it was a very real proposition that we would lose life during these fires." Notwithstanding all of the above, the court will note this fire was one of very many fires across the state of New South Wales in the 2019-2020 bushfire season. Not all fires were reported to the coroner. Not all fires reported to the coroner proceeded to a coronial inquiry into cause and origin. Not all fires that proceeded to a coronial inquiry into cause and origin will now proceed to further consideration via a general inquiry as part of Stage 2 of Your Honour's proceedings. It is submitted that it is not necessary for the Rumba Complex fire to proceed to further investigation via a general inquiry. Whilst the brief of evidence includes questions from community members about why certain decisions were made at certain points, it is not possible for this court to attempt to answer every question raised in every brief collated across the 2019-2020 season. And other case studies will pick up on similar issues in the course of Stage 2 representative case studies. Those case studies will serve to represent the whole. The following chronology for the Rumba Complex fire is drawn from witness statements and other material within the coronial brief of evidence. It certainly does not purport to be an exhaustive account. Further, given that the inquiry is limited to cause and origin of the fire, it will focus upon such matters with only a brief recitation of fire progress until the fire was declared out. Page 16 of the coronial brief will now be brought up on the screen. On 16 October 2019, an electrical thunderstorm passed through the area where the Rumba Dump fire originated. Page 16 here records the lightning strike data for that period of time and across the Tappan Tops National Park, with the Dingo Tops Trail or Dingo Tops Road marked through the middle of the park. Then, moving to page 25 of the brief, Your Honour will see a similar representation, again showing lightning strike data in that period. What this data records is that some 67 lightning strikes were recorded in the area within the space of 2 hours between about 7:20, well, it's less than 2 hours, within a period of time between approximately 7:29 p.m. and 8:44 p.m. Then, Your Honour, on 17 October 2019, there was light rainfall in the area. On 18 October 29, Colin Temple, a supervising field officer for the Manning Great Lakes area with the National Parks and Wildlife Service, was on duty in the Tappan Tops National Park. He was working on a tractor at the Boot Hill Forestry Camp. At about 10 a.m, Mr Temple spotted some smoke down a gully about 2 kilometres northwest from the camp along Dingo Tops Road. Mr Temple investigated and is the first eyewitness to the Rumba Dump fire. He observed the fire was burning in very dense, viney country, which was difficult to access and was at that time about 10 by 8 metres in size. Mr Temple had the presence of mind to look for indications of what might have caused the fire. He didn't see any evidence of lightning strike. There had been rain the previous day, and so he inspected Dingo Tops Road near the fire's origin, looking for any tyre or horse tracks on the roadway. There was nothing visible which might suggest human presence in the vicinity of the fire. Mr Temple next reported the fire to a colleague by radio, and a small team were marshalled to fight the fire with Mr Temple, accompanied by 2 water bucketing helicopters. At 11:08 a.m, the Rumba Dump fire was authorised as going on ICON, the Incident Control online service of the RFS, but at this time was being managed by the National Parks and Wildlife Service. At 1:08 p.m, Wendy Smith, performing the role of air observer, took an aerial photograph of the nascent fire. This is taken from page 110 of the brief, which shows the fire in its proximity to Dingo Tops Road through the National Park. According to Mr Temple, by the end of 18 October 2019, he thought that the fire was under control. However, when he returned to the scene the next morning, 19 October 2019, the fire had in fact spread a further 200 metres beyond containment. Despite efforts to contain the fire, it only continued to spread in the days that followed. As has already been noted, the Rumba Dump fire was not the only fire burning within the vicinity during October and November 2019 and the months that followed. At different times in October and November, several fires were burning in relative proximity, including the Riley Creek Trail fire that Your Honour has already had regard to, the Thunderbolts Way fire to the east, so these being the fires that later merged with the Rumba Dump fire to form the Rumba Complex fire, but also the Lyrebird fire to the northwest, the Coombs fire to the north, and the Reserves Road fire to the northeast. Still within the Mid-Coast and Port Macquarie Hastings council areas, other fires such as the Hillville fire and the Failford Road Darrawank fire also presented threats to large population centres. Those charged with responsibility for coordination of firefighting efforts faced difficult decisions in allocating limited firefighting resources to the areas which faced the greatest risk of harm. In many cases, efforts were prioritised on immediate, heavy-weighted response to new fires rather than established fires, in order to avoid new fires becoming large, complex and problematic, and to try and restrict fire impact and spread. So, for example, in the context of police resourcing, DCI Blackman told the court that his role was to manage police investigation into crimes and coronial matters within the district, but given the nature of these devastating bushfires and the impact on both the human and property toll, it became a situation where all the resources available to manning Great Lakes were absorbed into our fundamental obligation to save lives and secondary obligation, which is saving property. So all police resources were drawn into that, myself included, to be operational during this period. DCI Blackman also told the court, in his words, the difficulty during this period was the large demand on resources for those fundamental obligations of saving life and property. So predominantly all of my resources, particularly in the more critical times during the fires, they were deployed doing as any other sworn police officer would do, which was trying to evacuate houses, notify people of the dangers, and responding to the requests that were coming in aplenty. At 1:50 p.m. on 26 October 2019, then New South Wales Rural Fire Service Commissioner Shane Fitzsimmons, AOAFSM, made a declaration under Section 44 of the Rural Fires Act 1997, ceding to the RFS the operational response for all bushfires burning generally in the Mid-Coast and Port Macquarie Hastings local government areas, including the Rumba Dump fire. The Rumba Dump fire then made a significant run between 9 and 11 November 2019, impacting largely residential properties in Kapara, Boban, Kylabark, Strathcedar and Werrell Flat. Meanwhile, fire progression mapping demonstrated that to the southwest of the Rumba Dump fire, the Thunderbolts Way Bretty fire had merged with the Rayleigh Creek Trail fire, and the Hillville fire had also commenced. On 15 November 2019, the Rumba Dump fire merged with the Thunderbolts Way and Rayleigh Creek fires, thereafter being managed as the Rumba Complex. It was not until sometime towards the end of December 2019 that the Rumba Complex fire was contained, and on 24 January 2020 it was authorised as out on ICON. Your Honour has received into evidence a volume comprising 240 pages, which includes statements from members of New South Wales Police and the National Parks and Wildlife Service, a report from a court-appointed expert fire investigator, Mr. Richard Woods, AFSM, Rural Fire Service documents, fire progression maps, and Bureau of Meteorology weather data. DCI Rodney Blackman and Mr. Woods then gave oral evidence on 21 March 2022. Turning to cause and origin investigation. There was no cause and origin investigation of the Rumba Dump fire by the RFS. Officers from the New South Wales Police Forensic Services and Technical Services Command undertook a scene investigation on 19 May 2020, some 7 months after the fire had started. DCI Blackman was asked about the reasons for this delay in his evidence. He noted the hazards of access to the area of origin as a result of fire damage, so things such as fallen trees at the scene, as well as its remote location and the limited availability of the Forensic Services and Technical Services Command, who were involved in so many investigations across the season. That is, there were a very large number of fires to be investigated and only a relatively limited pool of investigators to complete the work. Present at the 19 May 2020 scene investigation were trained fire investigator Senior Constable Gary Kemp from Forensic and Technical Services in Lismore, who provided two statements to Your Honour, along with Senior Constable Michael Nemeth, Detective Sergeant David Frith, and Colin Temple, the National Parks and Wildlife Service field officer who first observed the Rumba Dump fire on 18 October 2019. Mr. Temple guided the party to the area where he had first observed the fire. I'll now have some pages brought up on screen from the brief illustrating what was obvious to them when they inspected the scene some months later. So this will be page 35 through to 37 of the brief. Senior Constable Kemp's analysis of the remaining fire indicators at the scene, along with Mr. Temple's anecdotal observations, suggested the fire originated in the general vicinity of the Spur Ridge. The remaining fire indicators demonstrated the fire then moved rapidly uphill from the gullies to Dingo Tops Road and then further uphill beyond that. So Your Honour will recall from one of the photos today, Your Honour can see a car parked on the verge of Dingo Tops Road, and the person taking the photograph is located somewhat down a gully from that roadway. However, of course, the fire scene investigation was hampered by the fact that in the intervening 7-month period, there was substantial regrowth, which limited the ability to identify other potential fire indicators. At or close to the point where Mr. Temple had first observed the fire, Senior Constable Kemp identified a large dead tree that had fallen free of its heavily charred stump on a spur ridge between two steep gullies. This is illustrated in the photograph at page 29 of the brief. All right, so it's the top photograph from this page illustrates the fallen free, the tree that has fallen free of a heavily charred stump on a ridge between two steep gullies, which run from the valley floor up to an access path, along which they were able to access the scene from Dingo Tops Road. Having observed the fallen tree, Senior Constable Kemp was unable to determine whether it had been directly affected by lightning strike. He next considered another tree which was nearby and which in his view might have displayed an area of damage arising from lightning strike. Senior Constable Kemp did not find any evidence of human intervention at the scene, but again, the court would note that his investigation took place many months after the fire had passed through. The best evidence as to the absence of human activity impacting upon the cause of the fire remains the evidence of Mr. Temple, who didn't see any evidence of human presence when he first arrived at the scene. Senior Constable Kemp returned to the fire scene again on 5 January 2022 at the request of the council assisting team to reconfirm the coordinates of the fallen tree where the fire was suspected to have originated. This was important because, as already noted, lightning strike data suggested the presence of lightning in the general area on 16 October 2019. Mr. Richard Woods then provided an expert report at the request of the court and gave evidence before Your Honour. Mr. Woods' qualifications and roles include Adjunct Professor in Wildfire Investigation at Charles Sturt University, Chair of the International Association of Arson Investigators, International Association of Fire Investigators, and Director of Wildfire Investigations and Analysis, an international wildfire consultancy. While he did not undertake a scene examination himself, on a document review, Mr. Woods was able to form an opinion that the cause of the Rumba Dump fire was lightning strike. He had regard to the photographs taken by Senior Constable Kemp. In particular, Mr. Woods placed emphasis on the photos of the large tree which had fallen over, leaving behind a burnt trunk and stump. Page 25-11 of the brief will now come up on the screen. This is a photograph that was taken by police but marked by Mr. Woods in the course of his report. He concluded that what's shown here is that the inner wood had burnt at a very high temperature, burning through to the surface of the trunk at 2 points. Mr. Woods was of the opinion that the tree had burnt for some time while still standing and then continued to burn after it fell over. A photograph of the tree's stump showed it had been fully consumed internally, causing the trunk to fall. So this is the photograph taken from page 25-12 of the brief. Again, a police photograph, but marked by Mr. Woods in the course of his report. Mr. Woods emphasised the presence of unburnt external sections of the trunk. So you can see that highlighted with the yellow arrows. Some of which were still angled towards the direction in which the trunk fell. The unburnt sections suggested the fire had consumed the available fuel on the ground by the time the trunk fell, such that after it fell, the fire moved to another area and did not impact the unburnt section of the remaining stump. Fire indicators, including angle of char and a vortex effect, suggested to Mr. Woods the fire had burnt uphill from the fallen tree towards Dingo Tops Road. As for the tree nearby to the burnt-out stump that Senior Constable Kemp thought might have displayed evidence of lightning strike damage, Mr. Woods took a different view. He thought that tree had the appearance of fire having climbed up the fibrous bark trunk to produce the charred effect that Senior Constable Kemp had observed. Mr. Woods further told the court in his evidence that traditionally, when a large tree is struck by lightning, it also has a mechanical impact, and that will see the fracturing of the timber and in particular large limbs being dropped and so forth. There doesn't appear to be any fracturing of the trunk layer in that image taken by Senior Constable Kemp. Thus, the evidence raised the prospect of lightning strike as a cause of the Rumba Dump fire, although the location of the strike was not agreed as between Senior Constable Kemp and Mr. Woods. Regardless, and as a result of his review of the photos, Mr. Woods asked for lightning strike data for the month prior to the fire being observed near Dingo Tops Road. This was because, as he told the court, a fire caused by lightning strike can burn for weeks, if not months, before it is noticed. This lightning strike data obtained at the request of Mr. Woods revealed a number of lightning strikes across the previous month, with the closest strike to the suspected area of origin for the fire indeed occurring on 16 October 2019. On that occasion, a number, somewhere in the vicinity of 67, strikes were recorded. None of these were in the precise location where Mr. Temple had first observed the fire, with the nearest strike recorded some 1.5 kilometres away. Mr. Woods, however, told the court lightning strike detection systems are not infallible. It stated that they record between 80 and 90% of all lightning strikes, and some therefore are not recorded. Mr. Woods referred to other factors or parameters that may affect the reliability of strike data, including distance from Sydney, affecting the degree of variance between where a strike is recorded and where it in fact struck. He also referred to mountainous terrain as introducing another variable parameter. As to the fact that Mr. Temple himself had not observed evidence of lightning strike when he attended the scene of the fire, Mr. Woods suggested that the suspect tree may have already fallen over by the time Mr. Temple attended the scene. Whilst the fire was yet in its incipient stages when Mr. Temple first saw it, Mr. Woods placed emphasis on the fact that there was rainfall on 17 October 2019, that the area was 600 metres above sea level and in an east-southeasterly forested slope. In his view, these factors would have inhibited the rate of fire spread and intensity of the fire even after the damaged tree fell. In his report, Mr. Woods eliminated other potential causes of the Rumba Dump fire for lack of evidence, including campfire, smoking, incendiary, deliberate, juvenile or children involved in fire play, debris burning, equipment use, railway and miscellaneous human activity, such as fireworks or welding and the like. In forming these opinions, Mr. Woods took into account the remoteness of the location, including the ruggedness of the bushland, making it difficult to access by foot and impossible to access by vehicle. Mr. Woods was ultimately prepared to go further than Senior Constable Kemp and conclude that the cause of the fire was as a result of lightning strike in the area where Mr. Temple first observed the fire. It is submitted that the court would accept Mr. Woods' evidence. At the close of the inquiry on 21 March 2022, Counsel assisting Your Honour foreshadowed formal submissions as to the cause and origin of the Rumba Complex fire. Consistent with those foreshadowed submissions, it is submitted that the cause and origin of the Rumba Complex fire was a lightning strike to a tree on the evening of 16 October 2019 in a gully broadly east of Dingo Tops Road in the Tappan Tops National Park. Finally, Your Honour, those assisting the court express their sincere gratitude to those who have aided Your Honour's inquiry and provided information to the court to assist with your consideration of the Rumba Complex fire.
Thank you, Ms Ward. Yes, Mr Wilcox.
Your Honour, I'll move on to the Ruin Castle inquiry. These are the closing submissions for the inquiry into the cause and origin of the fire known as the Ruin Castle Kadumba Valley Fire. The inquiry has been conducted pursuant to Section 30, subsection 1 of the Coroners Act and is accordingly limited to determining the cause of the fire and the area of its origin, if able to be established to the satisfaction of the court. This fire was one of very many fires across the state of New South Wales in the 2019-2020 bushfire season. Not all fires were reported to Your Honour or a coroner. Not all fires reported to the coroner proceeded to a coronial inquiry into cause and origin. Not all fires that proceeded to a coronial inquiry into the cause and origin will continue to further consideration via a general inquiry as part of Stage 2 of Your Honour's proceedings. It is submitted that it's not necessary for the Ruin Castle fire to proceed to further investigation via a general inquiry. Other case studies will pick up on matters that also arise in the Ruin Castle, including via a consideration of the Grose Valley Fire, Mount Wilson, also burning within the Blue Mountains local government area in late 2019. The following chronology for the Ruin Castle fire is drawn from the witness statements and other material from within the brief of evidence. It doesn't purport to be an exhaustive account. Given that this inquiry is limited to cause and origin of the fire, the chronology will focus upon such matters within a brief recitation of fire progress until it was declared out. Turning to that chronology, the Ruin Castle fire burns for slightly over 2 months, predominantly in the Kadumba Valley of the Blue Mountains National Park. That area is just south of the township of Katoomba in the Blue Mountains local government area, encompassing the lands of the Darug and Gunungurra people. Just on screen now, Your Honours, from page 5 of the coronial brief, showing the town of Katoomba up the top left of the screen on the Great Western Highway. And then south of the township and escarpment is the Ruin Castle walking track, which tracks down on that high ridge line to the Ruin Castle natural rock landmark, which is visible from the Three Sisters Walk at the end of Katoomba. This fire burned from 27 November 2019 to 6 February 2020 and destroyed approximately 17,058 hectares of national park. Opening submissions by council assisting had submitted that the Ruin Castle fire did not damage residential property, although some huts at the Jemby Rinja Eco Lodge at Blackheath and various outbuildings were damaged. That was based upon information obtained by the officer in charge of the investigation, Detective Senior Constable Nicole Dunn. Police efforts to obtain information as to property damage included collating and reviewing property questionnaires completed by affected property owners in the regions affected by the Gospers Mountain in Wollamai National Park / Gross Valley Mount Wilson fire or fires, which may not have captured people affected by the reach of the Ruin Castle fire. Obtaining information from the Blue Mountains City Council, speaking with the National Parks and Wildlife Service about the reach of the fire, and reviewing data from the Emergency Information Coordination Unit as collated by New South Wales Department of Customer Service. It seems no reports of property damage were recorded by New South Wales Police. This evidence, as summarised in the opening submissions into the Ruin Castle fire, prompted Mr. Robert Morse, captain of the Megalong Valley Volunteer Bushfire Brigade, to contact the council assisting team. Mr. Morse provided a list of properties he had compiled from memory that he understood were either directly impacted by the Ruin Castle fire or affected by fire suppression activities in the course of fighting the fire. He said that the damage to the Eco Lodge arose during the Gross Valley Mount Wilson fire. Mr. Morse's list of affected properties included known damage to one cabin and a house, and otherwise damage to fencing, bridges, and building material and the like. It tended to confirm that no homes were lost, although one house and one cabin were damaged. Mr. Morse also said, quote, "Hopefully you can understand that the inquiry not acknowledging the impact of the fire on Megalong Valley will be seen as another instance on top of the significant delay of any official damage assessment, which resulted in delay of official recovery of any official recognition of the impact of the fires on our community," close quote. That was certainly not the intention of the submissions. Indeed, the council assisting team have tried to acknowledge in this and other fires that the statistics we refer to, based upon the evidence contained within the coronial brief, cannot hope to capture the reach of these fires and the emotional, financial and physical costs to the communities who bore the brunt. As a result, the council assisting team took further steps to try and clarify this via a subpoena to the Blue Mountains City Council. The council provided further information extracted from the council's bushfire register for properties in the Megalong Valley Township. This was based upon self-report by individuals and was not information which had been verified or confirmed by the council. Further, the officer in charge of the investigation emailed Mr. Morse to see if he could provide any further details. As a result, the evidence as it stands suggests that no houses were destroyed by this fire. One house may have been damaged. However, some additional buildings and structures were impacted, including damage incurred to various residential outbuildings, a cabin, and infrastructure such as fencing, in particular within the Megalong Valley area. It may be accepted that as fires merged across the 2019 to 2020 bushfire season, it was not always easy to determine which fire may have destroyed or damaged which structure, and official counts of damage and loss do not necessarily correlate one with the other. Turning to a chronology, Your Honour, between 25 to 27 November 2019, a series of storms passed over the Warragamba catchment area and a significant number of lightning strikes were recorded. As at 27 November 2019, fire crews were already involved in fighting another fire within Blue Mountains National Park, being the Red Ridge Trail Fire. The Greenwattle Creek, Lake Burragarang, and Gospers Mountain, Wollamai National Park fires were both also burning in close proximity to this area. It was while combating the Red Ridge Trail Fire that crews became aware of a fire near ruined castle, detecting smoke from the location at 3:44 p.m. Ruined Castle is both a walking track through Blue Mountains National Park and a natural rock formation which is a landmark on that trail. Sometime after the smoke was first reported, Ms. Lee Nolan, who was performing the role of National Parks and Wildlife Service Air Attack Supervisor, was asked to fly over the area and provide a situation report as to the status of the fire and to take photos. At this point, Ms. Nolan had been working on a nearby Greenwattle Creek Lake Burragarang fire, also known as the Lake Burragarang Fire. She knew that the remote location would make access difficult, and that in addition to any suppression efforts involving aerial resources, it would take specialist remote area fire teams to work on the fire on the ground the next day. Ms. Nolan was able to photograph from the air the suspected ignition point for the fire. This was in rugged country to the west of the ruined castle walking trail. On screen now, Your Honour, is page 86 of the coronial brief, showing one of those aerial photographs taken by Ms. Nolan on the afternoon of 27 November 2019. And Your Honour will see visible on the ridgeline is both ruined castle walking track and the ruined castle rock formation itself in the centre of the screen. Additionally, around 4:30 p.m. on the same day, 27 November 2019, Brendan Wilson, Senior Field Officer for the Catchment Remote Area Fire Team of the National Parks and Wildlife Service, became aware of the fire at Ruined Castle. Around 4:50 p.m, Mr Wilson attended the fire scene in a Park Air helicopter and observed a fire about 50 by 40 metres in size, which he confirmed on radio. At that time, and because the fire had been detected within the Blue Mountains National Park, the National Parks and Wildlife Service were responsible for coordinating suppression efforts. Around 5:35 p.m, Mr Wilson and a raft crew were winched into the fireground by helicopter. They fought the fire with the assistance of helicopters, which were bucketing water seeking to contain it. Mr Wilson and his team were winched out at 7:15 p.m, at which time he observed the fire to be very benign with no active fire. On the morning of 28 November 2019, the fire had breached containment lines overnight and fire behaviour and size had increased. Remote area firefighting crews were again winched into the fireground and continued to fight the fire, assisted by water bucketing helicopters. At 12:49 p.m, Ms Nolan flew over the ruined castle fire to assess best options for dropping a line of retardant. On screen now, Your Honour, is page 87 of the coronial brief. Another photo taken by Ms Nolan, now of course on the 28th of November, showing how that fire had developed, again in proximity to the ruined castle walking track, but from another angle from the last image. Aerial and remote area firefighting ground crews continued to fight the fire over the days that followed, but encountered challenging conditions as the fire continued to grow, including lower than expected humidity overnight on 29 to 30 November 2019, and wind changes endangering ground crews. On 30 November 2019, Nigel Holland, National Parks and Wildlife Service Senior Field Officer, who was assisting the remote area firefighting team in early fire suppression efforts, attended Castle Head, which overlooked the fireground. He observed that fire activity had again increased overnight. On screen is page 124 from the coronial brief, showing the observations and photographs taken by Mr. Holland on the morning of the 30th of November 2019. The next day, 1 December 2019, the fire broke containment lines under strong westerly winds and quickly spread in all directions due to swirling winds in the valley. Efforts to bring the fire back under control were unsuccessful due to the threat of fire on properties on the southern edge of Leura, Wentworth Falls and Scenic World, where a sprinkler system and fire and rescue New South Wales teams were working to protect that particular asset. At 4 p.m, a declaration was made under Section 44 of the Rural Fires Act, with the result that the management of the fire came under the responsibility of the New South Wales Rural Fire Service. The fire continued to grow throughout December, spreading into the Megalong Valley. By 2 December 2019, fire progression maps clearly showed how far the Ruan Castle fire had burnt in just a few days, although dwarfed by other fires in the area. The later series of fire progression maps showed the fire continue to spread across the next few weeks. On screen is a fire progression map from the 2nd to the 3rd of December 2019, showing the Ruan Castle fire up north in the centre of the page, in proximity to the Great Western Highway, with the significantly more developed Greenwattle Creek and Cowmung River fires down towards its south. The Ruan Castle fire only moderated on 20 December 2019 and progression was made on containment. It was not until the end of 28 December 2019 that the fire was thought to be largely contained. On 5 January 2020, the fire was downgraded to patrol status, and on 19 January 2020, the Section 44 declaration was revoked. On 1 February 2020, the fire began to stop spreading. Finally, on 6 February 2020, the Ruan Castle fire was authorised as out following rainfall. As a result, the Ruan Castle fire burned an estimated 17,058 hectares over 72 days. On screen now, Your Honour, is fire progression mapping from 6 to 7 February 2020, being the day that Ruan Castle fire was marked out. Your Honour will see it at the top of the screen, almost merging with the much larger Greenwattle Creek fire, which had in the intervening months expanded up north significantly. Turning to the evidence Your Honour received in this inquiry, the court received a volume of material comprising a brief of evidence of 537 pages, including statements from members of New South Wales Police, Rural Fire Service, National Parks and Wildlife Service, from those who observed the fire and responded to it whilst it was in its infancy. It also includes RFS operational documents, lightning strike data, mapping from the RFS and Bureau of Meteorology weather data. Detective Senior Constable Nicole Dunn, Mr Darren Howe, Ms Lee Noland and Mr Nigel Holland gave oral evidence on the 10th of May 2022 when Your Honour sat to hear this matter in Katoomba. Turning to expert evidence and key conclusions, Detective Senior Constable Dunn ultimately concluded that the Ruan Castle fire commenced on or before 27 November 2019, caused by a lightning strike to a tree in the vicinity of the Ruan Castle rock formation. Notably, there were a number of lightning strikes between 25 to 26 November 2019 that could have started the fire, with the fire only becoming visible initially via a smokestack on 27 November 2019. Detective Senior Constable Dunn provided evidence that the area of origin was remote. She was able to eliminate other potential causes of the fire, specifically power lines, campfires, smoking, human activity, equipment use, juvenile fire play, and rail infrastructure. Detective Senior Constable Dunn's conclusions were largely based upon the expert evidence from the RFS fire investigator. Detective Senior Constable Dunn did not herself have fire investigation qualifications, and she did not attempt to investigate the scene for herself. Rural Fire Service investigator Darren Howe also gave evidence in relation to his investigation into the cause and origin of the Ruan Castle fire. He observed the scene of the fire on 22 January 2019 via helicopter. He told the court that this was necessary because the walking tracks into the area of origin were partially destroyed, and there was a danger of falling trees further blocking the track if an attempt was made to approach on foot. Plans to winch Mr. Howe down to the ground from a helicopter were also frustrated, and this left an aerial observation of the fire scene as the only option. This process was made easier by the fact that the Park Air helicopter that had earlier taken photos of the incident fire had included GPS coordinates. According to Mr. Howe, quote, "We used the GPS to locate the actual position, and then the degrees will tell you which direction you need to face, and then we roughly tried to sit about the same height off the canopy with our aircraft as the Park Air aircraft was, and then we could project a line roughly to where the estimate place of that ignition point was," end quote. Having performed a grid search from the air, Mr. Howe was then able to target an area of differential burn, which, quote, "once again could give us an indication that that's where the initial fire started," end quote. Otherwise, there were no other macro indicators of fire spread discernible from the air. On screen, Your Honour, is page 67 of the coronial brief, an image taken by Mr. Howell in the helicopter inspecting the fire scene, and they're identifying a tree suspected of having been struck by lightning. Your Honour will get a better image of that in due course. Mr. Howell was eventually able to isolate a single tree that he suspected had been struck by lightning. There were no other trees with lightning damage evident from the flyover. Mr. Howe suggested, and it's submitted the court should accept in all the circumstances, this lightning-struck tree was the point of origin of the Ruan Castle fire. Being brought on screen in a moment, Your Honour, is pages 71 and 72 of the brief, showing in greater detail in the centre of the page a black, apparently lightning-struck tree with some damage to its external, and also it seems to have lost the crown. The next image is now on screen, page 72, further zoomed in, that being the tree Mr. Howell identified in his evidence. Mr. Howell told the court, by reference to some of the photos he took from the air, quote, "Lightning will have a lot of effects on trees, and it will depend on the amount of lightning that strikes the tree. It will depend on the structure and the integrity of the tree or any faults in the tree. But you can see this one, the main indicator here that we're looking at. If this was a tree that was just burnt, it wouldn't have that unburnt timber at the top of the tree. So this is showing that something's caused this tree to weaken very quickly and it snapped. But if that was caused by fire, you would expect that the whole trunk of a tree to actually be charring at the top. It wouldn't have clean timber where the tree snapped from some external source," end quote. Furthermore, the fact that there was no weathering on the exposed timber was significant, as the wood would be expected to decay and change colour over time. This suggested the lightning strike was relatively recent. As referred to above, the court had the benefit of photographs taken by Mr. Howell of the scene, which demonstrated the remoteness of the location. This was relevant for two different reasons. Firstly, the remoteness of the location was relevant because the more remote the location, the less likely it was that human activity was implicated in fire cause. Here, the court also had the benefit of evidence from Nigel Holland, Senior Field Officer with National Parks and Wildlife Service, who had been winched into the fire ground in early fire suppression efforts by a remote area firefighting team. Mr. Holland was an important witness for another reason. Because he was so familiar with the layout of the National Park, he was able to estimate that the distance from the trail to the point where the smoke column was visible was maybe 300 to 400 metres, with no hiking trails or fire trails linking the two spots. So a person walking the trail and wanting to reach the point where the smoke was likely to have originated would have had to clear their own way through the bush from the trail. Further, there were no nearby campsites in the vicinity of the point where the smoke was first observed, and it is conceded that this evidence only goes so far and does not definitively exclude the possibility that the fire was a result of human activity, whether intentional or unintentional. But it is submitted that in the absence of a cause and origin investigation at ground level, the remoteness of the location is a key or a relevant factor in excluding the possibility the fire was a result of human activity. Second, and more importantly, the remoteness of the location might explain how a lightning strike to a tree might take some days or weeks prior to actually igniting a fire, which is eventually observed by humans. In this regard, Mr. Howell noted that upon his review of lightning strike data, there were 2 strikes on the evening of 25 November 2019, which were likely contenders for having ignited the Ruan Castle fire. On screen now is page 77-4 of the coronial brief, showing lightning strikes recorded during a period from 25 to 26 November 2019, proximate to where the Ruan Castle fire started, which is the khaki shading in the centre of the screen. Turning to cause and origin, Your Honour, it is submitted that the court could be satisfied that the area of origin for the Ruan Castle fire was in remote bushland to the west of the Ruan Castle walking trail. The Ruan Castle fire was caused by a lightning strike on 25 November 2019. Those assisting the court expressed their thanks to the officer in charge of the investigation and the witnesses involved in the cause and origin investigation for their assistance with the coronial inquiry into the Ruan Castle fire.
Thank you, Mr Wilcox.
Your Honour, I note the time. There's one more inquiry. Would it be convenient for the morning adjournment?
Yes. Let's take the morning adjournment and we'll resume at 12 o'clock.
Silence, please. All stands. Coroner's court is temporarily adjourned. Silence, please. All stand. This coroner's court resumes.
Yes, Mr Wilcox.
Yes, Your Honour. These are the closing submissions for the inquiry into the Little L Laguna fire. This inquiry has been conducted pursuant to Section 30, subsection 1 of the Coroners Act 2009 and is accordingly limited to determining the cause of the fire and the area of its origin if able to be established to the satisfaction of the court. The Little L fire was originally called the Stockyard Creek fire due to its proximity to Stockyard Creek. Stockyard Creek is not to be confused with Stockyard Flat. Your Honour has separately inquired into the Stockyard Flat fire originating within the Oxley Wild Rivers National Park between Kempsey and Walker, far to the north of Stockyard Creek and the Little L fire. Stockyard Creek is located in the Yengo National Park, northeast of an area called Finchley Lookout. The Yengo National Park stretches from Wiseman's Ferry to the Hunter Valley within the Blue Mountains World Heritage Area. The Little L fire and other fires with which it merged burnt across the Cessnock and Singleton local government areas, encompassing the lands of the Wonnarua people. The Little L fire later included within a complex or grouping of related fires. This group of fires was called the Little L Complex Fire. Some of the fires within the complex or grouping physically merged as the fires burnt. Other fires in close proximity might not have physically merged but were managed by the RFS as part of the one fire complex. The fires comprising the broader Little L Complex Fire were firstly the Stockyard Creek Fire, later named the Little L Fire, the Paddock Run Fire, the Mibradale Road Fire, later named the Drews Creek Fire, the Vault Creek Fire, the Blue Gum Fire, the New Founds Fire, and the Werrong Creek 2 Fire. The fires ultimately comprising the Little L Complex Fire were merged or amalgamated into the Little L Complex on diverse dates between 1 and 22 December 2019. The Little L Complex Fire burned for approximately 9 weeks, damaging an area of approximately 171,400 hectares and destroying or damaging at least 27 structures, including many homes in Laguna, Wollombi and Paynes Crossing. The precise number of homes, outbuildings or other structures damaged or destroyed in these fires is not precisely known. The fire complex was one of many fires burning across the state of New South Wales in the 2019 to 2020 bushfire season. Not all fires were reported to a coroner. Not all fires which were reported to the coroner proceeded to a coronial inquiry into cause and origin. And not all fires that proceeded to a coronial inquiry into cause and origin will continue to further consideration via a general inquiry as part of Stage 2 of Your Honour's proceedings. It is submitted that it is not necessary for the Little L fire to proceed to further investigation via a general inquiry. It is not possible for this court to attempt to answer every question raised in every brief collated across the 2019 to 2020 bushfire season. Other case studies from across the state will explore certain systemic issues arising from the response to the extraordinary events of that summer. This is not to dismiss the magnitude of the loss experienced by people in the path of the Little L fire or the other fires in that complex. Similar tales of loss extend across the state and cannot adequately be captured in these proceedings. Turning to a chronology, the following chronology for the Little L Complex Fire is drawn from witness statements and other material within the brief of evidence. It doesn't purport to be an exhaustive account. Further, given that the inquiry is limited to cause and origin of the Little L fire within a larger fire complex, the chronology will focus upon the Little L fire with a brief recitation of when the fire merged or was amalgamated with other fires until declared out. Between 22 to 25 November 2019, a series of storms passed over to the Yengo National Park and a number of lightning strikes were recorded within 2 kilometres of the suspected point of origin of the Little L fire in the vicinity of Stockyard Creek. This is evident from Bureau of Meteorology lightning strike data. Other evidence obtained from the Bureau shows that while there were numerous lightning strikes, there was only minimal rainfall recorded in the weather stations closest to the area where the Little L fire was first observed. On the morning of 25 November 2019, National Parks and Wildlife Service Air Attack Supervisor Paul Sandilands was responding to the Gospers Mountain fire by aircraft. He told the court he was working on 6 different fires and supervising firefighting activities on all those fires at the time, which says something about the broader context within which the response to the Little L fire was placed. At some point on the morning of 25 November 2019, at the Incident Management Team location in Bulga, Mr. Sandilands was alerted to the possibility of a new fire in the vicinity of Stockyard Creek. The court does not know who first reported this fire or what they saw to alert them to its presence. Mr. Sandilands responded and investigated the scene from the air. He mapped 2 small fires in the vicinity of Stockyard Creek on his iPad and communicated it to the Fire Control Centre to organise a firefighting response. He identified a 3rd fire in the general area, but it was not mapped on the same map, providing details of the location of the Stockyard Creek fire. The other fire mapped at the same time as the Stockyard Creek fire was in the vicinity of Howes Trail, also within the Yengo National Park. Mr. Sandilands estimates the fires were about 4 kilometres away from each other in a direct line. On 26 November 2019, the Stockyard Creek fire was renamed the Little L fire. Water bucketing helicopters were deployed to attempt to contain the fire in remote reaches of the national park. Wind conditions prevented remote aerial firefighting teams from being winched into the scene, and there was no vehicular access. Later in the day, wind conditions and storm activity grounded all aircraft. Fire activity increased across the coming days, and by 29 November 2019, then Commissioner Shane Fitzsimmons, AO-AFSM, made a declaration under Section 44 of the Rural Fires Act. This gave the Rural Fire Service responsibility for fighting fires in parts of the Singleton and Cessnock local government areas, which included the Little L fire. On screen, Your Honour, is from page 350 of the coronial brief, showing the Little L fire as at 28 November 2019, clearly deep within National Park. Some localities were threatened by more than one fire on more than one front, extending beyond the group of fires that would ultimately become the Little L Complex fire, including the Gospers Mountain fire, the Thompsons Road fire, and the Kerry Ridge fire. On screen now, Your Honour, is page 205 of the coronial brief, showing fire progression from 28 to 29 November 2019. The Little L fire is, at this stage, really barely visible in the centre of the screen, surrounded by a number of other fires of similar, relatively small size, including Werrong Creek 2 and Blue Gum. But much more developed to the southwest is the Gospers Mountain fire, with which Your Honour is familiar from an earlier inquiry. These fires had the potential to heavily impact upon communities at Buckety, Laguna, Wollombi, Murray's Run and Conjawai. Approximately 2,500 structures were expected to come under threat over the following weeks. The complexity of the threat was heightened by the fact that containment lines previously prepared had been breached and firefighters were forced to fall back to main roads, villages and towns. On 1 December 2019, wind gusts increased erratic fire activity. Smoke eventually grounded aircraft. The Little L fire had spread across the Stockyard Creek track. The Blue Gum fire had merged with other fires, and it's difficult to track which fires merged and when, but that exercise is not necessary for the inquiry the court is presently conducting. On screen is page 358 of the coronial brief, showing a photo of fire activity as at 1 December 2019. And immediately next is page 359 of the brief, showing a closer view. The Little L fire and the Blue Gum fire were amalgamated and renamed the Little L Complex Fire on 1 December 2019. The Newfound fire was amalgamated into the Little L Complex on 3 December 2019. On 4 December 2019, the Little L Complex fire continued to burn in an easterly and southeasterly direction and was expected to encroach upon properties in the Wollombi and Laguna areas, such that crews were tasked to prioritise the protection of life and property. Between 6 and 7 December 2019, the Vault Creek fire, the Drews Creek fire, the Werrong Creek 2 fire were amalgamated into the Little L Complex fire. And on 7 December 2019, the Paddock Run fire made an extreme and anomalous 11-kilometre run and coalesced with the Little L Complex fire. On screen, Your Honour, is page 219 of the coronial brief, showing the Paddock Run fire in the centre in green, and showing the relative development of the Little L Complex since the last image, where those fires merged on the 7th of December. And further below, in blue, is a 3 Mile Creek, which would ultimately merge with these fires as well. On 23 January 2020, the Section 44 declaration for the Little L Complex fire was revoked. At 12:15 p.m. on 24 January 2020, the Little L Complex fire was authorised out. On screen now, Your Honour, is the final fire progression mapping from page 234 of the coronial brief, showing the Little L Complex and other fires between the period 22 to 29 January 2020, showing the total area affected by that complex of fires. Turning to the evidence received in the inquiry, Your Honour has received into evidence a volume comprising 377 pages, including statements from members of New South Wales Police, National Parks and Wildlife Service, a fire investigation statement, a statement from New South Wales Police Mapping Unit, Rural Fire Service documents, fire progression mapping, and Bureau of Meteorology weather data. The officer in charge, plainclothes Senior Constable Katie Platt, Paul Sanderlands, Project Officer from the National Parks and Wildlife Service, and Acting Senior Sergeant Yost Price gave oral evidence on 20 June 2022. Turning to the cause and origin investigation, there was ultimately no scene investigation for the Little L fire undertaken by New South Wales Police or the Rural Fire Service. In June 2020, the officer in charge, Senior Constable Platt, requested Polair to winch in a fire investigator to the scene. This was obviously some months after the fire had commenced, but it is possible that some macro indicators might have survived at the scene, and the investigation might have been able to rule out human activity as a potential cause for the fire. Unfortunately, but understandably, the helicopter was diverted mid-flight to a critical incident, a police shooting, and no further physical scene examination was attempted. In these circumstances, the court would place particular weight upon the evidence of Paul Sanderlands, the air attack supervisor with the National Parks and Wildlife Service, who also gave oral evidence before Your Honour. As outlined above, on 25 November 2019, Mr Sanderlands flew over the area of the Stockyard Flat fire at around 8 a.m. He recorded the location of both the Stockyard Flat fire and the Howes Trail fire. The court would therefore accept that the fire was first recorded by about 8 a.m. on 25 November 2019 and had been first observed sometime prior to that. It follows that the evidence given by Senior Constable Platt in her statement that the Little L fire commenced at 6:15 p.m. on 25 November 2019 is wrong. Senior Constable Platt rightly conceded her error in her oral evidence. In terms of possible human activity being implicated as the cause of the Little L fire, Mr. Sandilands was asked to consider the possibility that someone could trek from the scene of the Howes fire, located on or near an open trail within the national park, to the scene of the Little Elf fire. Mr. Sandilands told the court, quote, "The vegetation that I saw there, it's typical sandstone country, which is quite steep and difficult to walk around in. There was there appeared to be an old trail marked on an old map that I looked at. However, that trail is long overgrown and hasn't been used by, anyone using a motor vehicle for quite a long time, many years. When I say vehicle trail, I mean that, like, the cuttings for the trail are still there. However, there's full vegetation growing on the surface of the trail, so it's impossible to drive a motor vehicle along it. The trail is on a ridgeline. A person could, with, skills and experience, could walk along that area, but I believe it will be highly unlikely," end quote. This is important evidence in the absence of an examination of the suspected point of origin for the Little Elf fire. It is something that, if it is submitted, the court would have regard to in considering and ultimately excluding human activity as a possible cause for this fire. Whilst it can never be definitively ruled out, there is simply no evidence to rule it in. Mr. Sandilands gave further evidence that a fire initiated by lightning strike could smoulder undetected for a couple of days before starting to smoke and take a run. In remote country such as the Yengo National Park, a fire might burn for a period of time before becoming visible to humans. This, in turn, is relevant for the court's consideration of lightning strike data. As referred to earlier, lightning strike data was obtained from the Bureau of Meteorology and showed a number of strikes in the vicinity of the area where Mr. Sandilands first plotted the Little Elf fire. These strikes were then plotted onto a map of the suspected area by Acting Senior Sergeant Jos Price of the New South Wales Police Mapping Unit at the request of the officer in charge. This allowed the images to be played in court. The evidence shows that several of the lightning strikes in the vicinity of the suspected area of origin occurred after Mr. Sandilands first plotted the presence of the Little Elf fire. Hence, those strikes might have ultimately introduced more fire into the environment, but they did not cause the Little Elf fire. The lightning strike data did, however, demonstrate the presence of a lightning strike within 2 kilometres of the point where Mr. Sandilands first plotted the Little Elf fire, occurring on 22 November 2019 at 3:12 p.m. On screen, Your Honour, is page 198 of the coronial brief showing lightning strike data from 22 to 23 November 2019, showing one particular strike close to the initial mapped area of the Stockyard Creek, later Little Elf fire, showed in a shade of green at the centre of the screen. Finally, the court would note that in April 2022, Senior Constable Platt requested a cause and origin statement from the Forensic Technical Services Command of New South Wales Police. Detective Technical Acting Sergeant Alexander Gill from Newcastle Crime Scene Section provided a statement to the inquiry in May 2022. Detective Gill did not undertake a scene examination, but offered his opinion as to the cause and origin of the Little Elf fire on the strength of a paper review. He concluded that it was unlikely that there was human involvement causing the Little Elf fire, having regard to Mr. Sandilands' observations. He concluded that all information and evidence indicated that the fire was caused by lightning strike, based on lightning strike data and the detective's own training, knowledge and experience that this is a common cause of bushfires in the right conditions. Turning to cause and origin, it is submitted that the Little L complex fire originated as a result of lightning strike on the morning of 25 November 2019 in bushland in the Yengo National Park near Stockyard Creek, GPS coordinates latitude, longitude 30 degrees 56.248 -S and 151 degrees 00.906 -E. Those assisting the court express their sincere gratitude to those who have aided and provided information to the court to assist with the coronial inquiry into the Little L Complex fire.
Thank you, Mr Wilcox.
That's the final inquiry for today.
Yes, we will adjourn for today and resume tomorrow at 10 a.m. Thank you.
Silence, please. All stand. Current court is now adjourned.